Hello and welcome to The Wire. On the surface, it's a historic announcement. After an unprecedented 16-year gap, the Indian government has finally promised a nationwide caste census, a move that could reshape the country's politics for a generation. But we've been here before. In 2011, that same promise was made only to be meticulously and deliberately sabotaged from the inside, the data declared unusable and buried forever. It wasn't an accident, it was a political choice. So how can we know if this time is going to be different? What if you had the playbook for how the system cheats? Well, our guest tonight wrote that very playbook. Dr. Trina Vithayathil is a professor at Providence College and is also the author of the groundbreaking book, Counting Caste. She's a sociologist who forensically documented the secret machinery of state power used to kill the last census. And on this episode of Book Show, we use her definitive research to put the 2027 caste census plan under the microscope. We'll identify the red flags, expose the potential traps, and ask the most urgent question of all. Is this a genuine move towards social justice, or are we watching the first act of the most sophisticated political sabotage yet? Trina, welcome to the Book Show. Now, ever since the NDA government in, I think, the first week of June announced that they're going to do a caste census, my first response was that what are the various ways in which they can sabotage this? And then I started looking at the 2011 census, and I was trying to do some research to figure out if at all somebody has done some work in terms of how the 2011 census, the first experiment, was conducted. And I was glad that I came across your book. And as you know very well, your work, in fact, is an essential warning from history about how exactly a promise can be made and can be sabotaged as well. In fact, they say that the devil lies in the procedure and the details. So I wanted you to ask you, why did you write the book in the first place? What made you write the book in the first place?
Thank you so much for inviting me to Bookshook and giving me this chance to discuss my research. So I wanted to write the book because I really didn't expect. So as I started studying, the 2011 socioeconomic caste census, and seeing what was unfolding, and it raised so many questions about why the survey was unfolding as it did, why the particular questions were worded as they were over time, as the data was not published and eventually was deemed unusable. It raised a whole series of questions about why this massive state project failed, right? So it seemed important to document the failure of this first nationwide enumeration of caste in independent India, and to learn lessons from this massive project that mobilized so many resources but did not produce any caste-wise data for the public.
So in fact, I was going through your book and I found this phrase, which is also in the title. It's called bureaucratic deflection. So let's begin there, right? So can you help our viewers understand in very simple terms what this playbook of deflection or bureaucratic deflection, and how exactly does it work?
Okay, so this term bureaucratic deflection, I was trying to describe the process by which political leaders and bureaucrats stall or block policy changes, in particular policies and programs that seek to dismantle inequalities or redistribute resources more equitably. And I observed these processes of bureaucratic deflection occurring in my research related to, as I was mentioning, this first nationwide enumeration of caste in independent India. So political leaders agreed in May 2010 to collect caste-wise data in Census 2011 in response to organizing by caste census advocates. However, in the months that followed, political leaders and bureaucrats blocked the caste-wise enumeration in Census 2011 and rerouted it into another state project. There had been planning for a while for the next round of the below poverty line survey, and so they combined it into this project and renamed the whole project the 2011 Socioeconomic Caste Census, which I'll refer to as the SEC survey. So In observing this process unfolding of pushing the agreed upon caste-wise enumeration out of Census 2011 into this other state project, and then observing how it unfolded within this state project, I really saw several strategies of bureaucratic deflection, and maybe I can talk about a few of them that seem particularly relevant for the current situation. So the first one is that the ORGI, or the Indian Census Bureau, reframed the kind of public debate from a substantive conversation around the need to document caste-based inequalities, right? Why these data were important. And they shifted it to a sort of technical conversation, a methodological conversation, and shifted it to a series of questions of, how can we protect the integrity of the census? How can we ensure the accuracy of the head count, which are, of course, are important questions, but they use those questions to push for operational latitude, saying, well, let's figure out how's the best way to collect the data. And once they got that latitude, they convinced the political leadership to not collect the caste-wise data in the census. And so in this supposedly kind of apolitical conversation over methodology, what's the best way to collect the data, they push the data collection, the caste-wise data collection, out of the census, and the voices of sort of non-experts become silenced in this process. So that's kind of the first strategy. And then a second and very important one that happens in 2011 is that the data collection becomes then pushed into a less experienced part of the bureaucracy, a more peripheral part of the bureaucracy, and a less powerful part. So instead of having the caste-wise enumeration occur within the census, within the ORGI, within the powerful Home Ministry, it becomes part of the Ministry of Rural Development's project and the Urban Ministry as well. So that's a second sort of play that, in terms of this playbook, as you call it. Third, the actual questions related to the caste-wise enumeration and the answer options are not well suited for a caste-wise enumeration. So the first question the first caste-wise question, there's a question on religion and two caste-related questions. And the first caste-related question ends up including 4 answer options: scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, other, and no caste, no tribe. So you can see from that, the other category becomes this catch-all category for over 75% of the population. So for a supposed caste-wise enumeration, the first question makes little effort to classify over 75% of the population, right? The other becomes this catch-all to include diverse groups from Brahmins to Dalit Muslims, and so it's very, very broad. And then the inclusion of this no caste tribe option also creates an opt-out. And given that this is happening as part of a BPL survey, and we have to really realize that the no caste tribe option was meant to really appease comparatively privileged groups, as SCSD data collection is related. It's one of the one of the data for which the government automatically includes or excludes based on BPL status. So it's not that whole inclusion of no caste, no tribe is really about protecting caste privilege or giving the option for caste privileged groups to opt out. The second caste related question includes caste lists for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, as the decennial censuses of India have done. But for everyone else, it's this open-ended question, and there's no effort made to standardize the spelling of caste names or have local supervisors potentially postcode the data into administrative categories of general or OBC. So it's just this kind of catch-all, open-ended question where they get more than 4 million responses, right? So we can see that the structure of the questions and the answer options aren't well suited for a caste-wise enumeration, right? And then the fourth playbook I'll just quickly mention is that the caste-wise data are never published. So all this effort is made to, conduct the socioeconomic caste survey, collect the data from households, but the rest of the PPL data from the socioeconomic caste survey is published in 2015 and 2016, but the public still doesn't have access to the collected caste data. They get buried.
So just to help our viewers understand and see how this works in the real world, I specifically want you to talk about this particular example of your observation of a ground team in action. And it sort of is a testament to how grand plans are made in Delhi, but somehow when it comes to on-ground reality, how caste and power and these networks sort of take over and eventually sabotage the plans that have been made in a very faraway place. So could you sort of take us through that story?
Okay, yes. So the interview you're referring to involved a two-person data collection team. So this was also the first, the socioeconomic caste survey was the first nationwide survey to use tablet PCs during the interview. So the interviewer, the enumerator, was expected to ask questions during the interview. They had a 2-day training to prepare them for that. And then there was also a data entry operator or a DEO who was expected to record household responses into this tablet PC during the interview. So I observed this data collection team for a couple of weeks in early 2012 as they were enumerating 4 blocks in central Bangalore. And the enumerator was a government worker, an Anganwadi worker, like a lot of the enumerators for the SEC survey. And her husband was the data entry operator or the DEO, and he owned a small copy shop. So in this particular interview, they are interviewing a woman in her mid to late 30s, and she's providing information about her 4-person household, herself, her husband, her son, and mother-in-law. And we're in the ground floor unit of a 3-story apartment building. In actuality, what I observe is that the data entry operator and not the enumerator, first of all, is leading the interview and asking the questions. So that's the first thing that's very different from how the interview was imagined. He is collecting information about the head of household at the start of the interview, in this case, the respondent, her husband. And he's, recording basic information, going through each question about the husband's level of education, occupation, wages, etc. And then he asks about caste. And at the same time that he's asking about caste, he records automatically Hindu for religion without directly asking the woman about her husband's religion. The woman's response to the caste question is a little muffled initially. She says something like Shri, and so the DEO, he looks up from the tablet trying to, signal to her to respond again. And she says something that sounds like Shri Vaishna, and he continues to kind of look at her. And so she then responds with Brahmin, and he nods and he records in the tablet PC, he puts other for the kind of categorical, that first question of caste. And then for the second question of caste, he enters, types in Brahmin. And then later as the interview continues and he collects, information for each additional member of the household, he enters Hindu for the question on religion, other for the kind of categorical question on caste, and Brahmin for the more, he types in Brahmin for the more specific details. And he does that for all of the remaining members of the family without specifically asking them about their religion and their caste backgrounds. So thinking about, there's a lot happening in this one interview, and I'm just focusing on the responses related to religion and caste. So one thing that we can see is because there are no caste lists, right, within the interview, the DEO is kind of, the data entry operator is kind of inadvertently changing the level of classification from what the respondent initially says to what gets recorded as Brahmin. So it's important to point out that the DEO actually did not receive any sociological understanding of the survey and the questions, that he just had a technical training on how to use the tablet, because it was imagined that the enumerator would be the one, asking the questions. The DEO also records Hindu without explicitly asking, just using sort of cues from what's in the house and also the response on the caste question, and doesn't, again, ask about the other members of the household explicitly. So the male head of household's religion and caste identity gets attributed to everyone else in the household, right? So sort of reinforcing patriarchal norms and beliefs. And then, we also see that the use of tablets was heralded at the time as a sign of progress and development, but it really structures the interview process and is what leads the DEO to become sort of the lead interviewer in practice. And so this should also give us pause when we think about, Census 2027 as being, again, kind of described as the first digital census. And so this focus on, this digital aspect could divert time and energy away from planning for a meaningful caste-wise enumeration.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you about the lack of standardized caste lists during the 2011 census. So it also seems like it is a trap. In fact, the Hindu article also that I shared with you does quote a official saying that this time also they might have an extra drop box in the side, where they'll just mark the caste along with everything else that they're counting. As you clearly pointed out, the plans will be made somewhere else, but then on ground things take a very different turn. And as we know very well, the very act of counting is political, and therefore there is prime potential for sabotage. Do you think again this is a massive red flag this time around as well? And do you think a similar trap is being laid again?
So from what's been communicated so far, it's not exactly clear what the specific caste-related questions and answer option will be. They reference a drop-down menu. What's going to be in that drop-down menu is that, if data are not collected for each major state administrative category and caste lists are not provided for each one of those, so for along with caste lists for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, if there aren't caste lists for the general category, for the OBC category, then that again would be very problematic and would be a major barrier to successfully enumerating the caste-wise population. So it's of crucial importance that caste lists are created and finalized, and obviously this is a lengthy process. It's political, so that needs to be starting, now. It hasn't already started for each of the state administrative category, and not having those lists, as the previous example sort of anecdote shared, really leaves the process of classifying caste up to the individual, interview at that level, which you don't want to be to be happening. So
essentially, it makes the data unusable.
Exactly. Yeah. Yes. Exactly.
Okay. So you also touched upon how the previous census also was billed as a digital census, and now it's a season of digital India, and this also is being touted as a digital census. Now, my recent experience with the electoral roll revision, the special revision happening in Bihar, also points to this very fact that how digital penetration is not as deep and as rich as it is supposed to be in most other rural areas. Therefore, there has been a big backlog in terms of the forms being collected and the uploading of these forms, which essentially means that the enumerators were sitting on a stash of physical copies of all of these documents, and they've been trying to upload them later on in the back end. Now, of course, this is going to create a situation where it has been creating a situation where there are software glitches, for instance, right? Therefore, although technology is being built as built as something that will increase the efficiency of the entire exercise, it could might as well go the opposite direction as well. So how do you think this sort of digital exercise, and also the anecdote that you pointed about, the training that the enumerator gets in terms of using the technology, but a lack of sociological training, means a combination of this could undermine or delay the caste census result, or even give us potentially misleading data?
Yes. So this first digital census, as it's being heralded, with the possibility of self-enumeration, so that's another sort of new thing. So there's several new things happening at once. Could lead to a range of technical challenges, as you mentioned, from enumerators who, as of now, it seems like they're supposed to be using their own phones to enter a portal and record interviews, or certain households who will be allowed to do that as well. And prior to the start of the survey, or even at the start of the 2011 SEC survey, it was touted for its technological advances, including real-time data entry, but it had significant technical problems and, as we've been discussing, produced caste-wise data that were deemed unusable. So, as you're saying, advances in technology don't have to translate into better data. That is, not necessarily at all a given, right? So making the census digital doesn't mean in and of itself that the data will be better. Instead, what I'm worried about is that the time and resources that are going to be devoted, that will need to be devoted to get this first digital census off the ground, could provide, in some ways, a distraction away from the extensive planning work that needs to be happening to document, to collect caste-wise data, in terms of designing the questions in a meaningful way, coming up with the caste list, finalizing the caste list, which involves coordination between the center and all of the states and union territories to finalize the lists. And then, as you're saying, to then have a training for enumerators that then shows them the importance of these questions, the kind of complexity of enumerating caste privilege in particular, since that's something that in general hasn't happened in independent India, and from research around the world documenting privilege, so social and economic privilege through surveys, is challenging. So really kind of tackling that head on. And some of the other challenges that occurred with the last survey, really kind of studying those data that were unusable and learning from them, taking the time to make sure that those patterns aren't reproduced. So the focus on the digital census shouldn't preclude considerable planning that needs to happen, very thoughtful planning, so that the same mistakes aren't repeated in this upcoming caste-wise enumeration, from the design of the questions and answer options, the creation of caste lists, the development of the training for enumerators, and then also, because of this possibility of self-enumeration, households themselves are going to have to be given a clear understanding of why these data are important and what they are, so that they can provide their own information for self-enumeration as well.
Just to take you back to the sabotage theme, I was curious to understand, is are you saying that this sabotage is deliberate, or it could have happened either way, given the nature of how bureaucracy functions? Because largely, you must have heard of this phrase, which is quite often used in India, is that the law is fine, but the implementation of the law is where the issue always occurs. And my response to that is the people who are implementing this themselves do not believe that it is socially legitimate. Legally, it might be mandated upon these officers to go about, let's say, counting caste or implementing reservations in various fields, but somehow largely you find a lot of vacancies, and like you mentioned, the counting itself is not being done. So I wanted to understand if this is some sort of a deliberate way of doing things, or it's just a nature of bureaucracy where the superpower is that the state doesn't have as much capability, and also the bureaucracy's superpower, that is inaction as such. So is it because of that?
Well, I think if it was just, if we look at kind of the longer history, right, of collecting caste-wise data, across political administrations, there's been no interest in collecting caste-wise data in the census since independence, right? And so data were collected for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes only because it was agreed upon that was needed for the implementation of reservations, right? But we see that even after reservations get extended to OBCs, there isn't any effort to collect data on OBCs. So there's a real resistance from the bureaucracy to collect these data across political administrations in Census 2001 and again in Census 2011. So different parties were in power then in the center. So there is an active resistance in the bureaucracy to collect these caste-wise data. It reflects a longer history by which casteist ways of thinking are embedded within the state, particularly in the higher levels of government that have become less diversified despite reservations. And there's extensive scholarship that documents the kind of ways in which Brahminical ways of thinking are embedded within the state, right? So yes, there's an ideological resistance to counting caste. In particular, sociologist Satish Deshpande talks about this ideology of castelessness, which frames caste as a problem of the oppressed and obscures kind of caste privilege. So, okay, we have this longstanding practice of documenting data on scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, but there's been a real resistance to include a full caste enumeration that would document, caste from OBCs and the general category as well. So if there was no bureaucratic resistance, then when there have been administrative need for the data, it should have been collected in 2001 and 2001 and 2011, right? But they were not collected in the census, and there was a real pushback. Now the pushback gets framed in other ways, right? It doesn't get framed it gets framed as, we want to protect the integrity of the census. We want to ensure that the integrity of the head count proceeds, those sorts of things. So it's language of expertise and methodology that gets used in this case, right? But it connects with this broader ideology of castelessness that's sort of embedded within the ways in which the state has been functioning. Yeah.
Right. This probably was the question that I wanted to start off, but then, there are many arguments for the caste census. You have people who are just enamored by data, who probably say, that the more data you have about people, the better you can deliver governance to them. Of course, there are some champions of social justice who also make the argument that if at all you do have enough data about caste, then you could implement, let's say, the reservation policy much more accurately. Of course, there are other people who say that, if you have data on this, then you can implement some of the welfare schemes, because India runs a massive welfare scheme right now. So these are some of the arguments, right? But what exactly do you think this caste census, if at all it is done, assuming that it is done properly and accurately, what do you think it can actually achieve?
Yeah. So if it's done properly, and we've spent now, a little bit of time talking about what some of the very important steps and planning that would need to occur for that to happen, then, the data has the potential of providing information on caste, of course, from a caste-wise data on the entire population, but then also how that intersects with things like religion, with place of residence, with level of education, right? So that's one of the reasons that there's a push to collect the caste-wise data in the census, because of its ability to show how caste intersects with other sorts of capital and where people live, their access to public resources, and can shape and has the potential to be used to shape a whole range of policies, as you were saying, and programs. The additional piece of that is that it will also show the way in which caste and class privilege intersect, right? So the ways in which there's this sort of sense that, over time we've seen, as India has developed, that there's been kind of a disentangling of caste and class, but this data will show how caste and class are still deeply interconnected, right? So we can imagine that, for example, for the EWS quota, for example, which excludes caste oppressed groups, this should challenge that notion, right? That it makes sense, that it would make sense to have a quota around class that doesn't pay attention to how the deeply interconnected relationship between caste and class, right? So it would allow us to really see how power and privilege are interconnected, and we have to think about caste and class together, and these policies such as EWS, which exclude attention to or exclude caste oppressed groups in trying to implement a more class-based policy, really misunderstand how the two are still very deeply interconnected.
Having said that, I wanted to understand, of course, the caste census is going to reveal the what of it, the outcome. Every 5 years, 10 years, whenever you're doing a caste census, it's going to reveal, based on other data also that you collect regarding, let's say, ownership of land or education levels and many other factors. Of course, it's going to tell us the outcome of what happened over the last 10 years with these particular caste groups and how much progress they've made. But, there's a saying in India that people don't cast their vote, but they vote their caste. That is precisely because privilege, especially political benefits, are distributed on the basis of caste. Therefore, this aspect of how caste becomes, it goes about distributing these political benefits so unevenly. I don't think the caste census at any point is going to capture any of this, right? So, what else can the caste census capture apart from the fact that it can help, let's say, implement reservation policies and welfare policies better?
Yeah, I think the caste census can provide data that could be used for a variety of purposes, but it in and of itself is not an answer, right? So it's the beginning of, it's one step. It provides, if it's done well, it can provide useful data to inform policies, to distribute resources more equitably, to, whether it's welfare policies or reservation policies. But, viewing it as kind of the end all is I think, overstepping its significance, right? So the kind of real work of challenging caste hierarchy, of dismantling systems that reproduce privilege, right? This becomes sort of the data to help do that, but that work still needs to be done, right? So I think you're right to say, this is not in any ways the end goal. It is.
The reason I ask this is because given the standard of political discourse, even the opposition that is trying to that has put a lot of pressure on the NDA government for about the last 2 years. Is trying to sell it as a panacea, right? That it is the be all and end all. It's the solution to social justice in this country. So I just wanted to bring some attention to the fact that it is going to capture the outcome, the what of it, but I don't think it can capture the how of what happens in these 10 years, while you're counting caste.
Yeah, and it doesn't, if so, a couple of different things that, this your points are kind of bringing up, which is, there's sort of an ethical and a political motivation to collect the data, right? And if that, ethical and political motivation is to challenge caste hierarchy, challenge the concentration of power based on caste, then then it means that, as we've been talking about, we should be collecting data across all the caste categories. The caste lists should be made ahead of time, but then also thinking about, the data should be available to the public and should be used to ensure the implementation of social justice oriented policies. But it still leaves a lot to the ethics of how people are then going to use the data and for what purpose. And so I think, that's what you're raising, it's not a panacea by any means. It provides useful information that can prevent, that if used well, can prevent policies that tend to reproduce privilege and reproduce the kind of status quo. It can be used to powerfully challenge those types of programs. It can be used to create more equitable programs and policies, and to dismantle longstanding systems of discrimination. But that work still needs to be done by people and by groups. And so it's really, the hard work still remains after the collection of caste-wise data. That's just, one step in the process. Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, so long as the how is not revealed, in fact, it can work the other way, where it can, after probably 2 or 3 caste census, it can sort of solidify some of these inequalities within these caste groups, right? Saying that so long as this how is not revealed, people might go back to the same stereotype, saying, look, we've been counting caste, we've been doing a lot of things, and yet these communities are still at this particular level. Therefore, maybe something is inherently wrong with them. Right. But if the process of how all of this is happening, let's say how contracts are distributed, how investments are made through multiple companies of politicians, and all these companies go on to become successful companies, and you've touched upon Satish Deshpande. So all of this caste capital becomes secular capital after 1 or 2 generations, and then suddenly you realize that some castes are doing exceptionally well and the others are not doing after 3 or 4 census. So long as you don't reveal the how of this is happening, it can reinforce some of these stereotypes, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, the caste census provides a snapshot of, if it's done in 10-year intervals for the decennial census, it should be showing how, both privilege is concentrated and disadvantage is concentrated, and how that's changing over time, and why that's occurring needs to be researched along, the way. And so again, this is one source of data that's providing information about, caste and its intersection with, as you were saying, land and education, occupation, and other data that the census collects information on. And then the question is, why are most, if we look at, why is privilege concentrated in these particular castes? What are the systems that reproduce that? Why are particular groups continuing to not have access to land, what are the policies and mechanisms that reproduce that? So yes, there needs to be continued attention to the why of what we see across, caste-wise enumerations. Absolutely.
And just before I go to the last question, there's this one argument from against the caste census is that if you focus too much on caste, basically if you count caste, you are essentially reinforcing the idea of caste. In fact, this is what I've come across, that this solution to solving a problem is to just ignore it. You are willfully blind to that, and you think that if you don't count caste, if you don't acknowledge caste, it will go away. And probably that is why the caste wasn't counted post-independence in India. So how would you respond to this?
Yeah, well, that is a long-standing. So I guess I'd say, where is that concern coming from, right? I mean, I think that comes from a variety of people. It comes from groups that are doing little to fight caste power and the accumulation of caste-based privilege and its translation into more modern forms of capital, and it also comes, though, from some anti-caste scholar activists who are nervous that the process will reinforce caste. And so I think from that latter group, it's really important to keep that in mind. And one of the things that I think is quite important is the ORGI has been quite resistant to enumerating caste, and the way in which caste-wise data and the collection of caste-wise data did not occur successfully in the SEC survey means that there should be external oversight of this process that's unfolding. I think both from anti-caste scholars and activists who are for the enumeration of caste, but also those who are hesitant and worried about what this could mean over time. So I think, the inattention and the lack of collecting caste-wise data has not translated into caste-based privileges, being quite powerful and translating into these no forms. So I think we do need to understand and have an understanding of how caste intersects with other socioeconomic indicators. But I also think that to do this thoughtfully and to ensure that as the process is unfolding, that the larger motivation, which that is to challenge caste-based powers, to destroy, caste hierarchy, is kept in the back burner. So, or kept in mind. And so I think it's quite important that you have oversight from anti-caste scholars that are both, for the caste-wise enumeration, but also those that are concerned about how collecting these data, how it might reinforce caste in ways that, behind the power of the state. So yeah, I think it's important to keep those kind of critiques in mind, right? And not to ignore them in the process of designing the questions and the survey and thinking about the ethics of how to use the data.
So clearly you're telling us that the process itself has the potential to be sabotaged, and your book is a map of how that has been done in 2011. So finally, for our viewers, right, because the census is going to happen over the next 2 years, can you tell us how viewers in India can essentially pay very close attention to how this process will unfold over the next 2 years to sort of figure out, what are those warning signs that you as an expert would ask us to watch out for, when this process is happening? Like bureaucratic deflection, for instance, or any other sign that can immediately let us know that something is off.
Yeah. So one thing is that making sure that there is a detailed analysis of the religion and caste data from the 2011 SEC survey. To, you know, if we've already gone through the process of doing it once and it fails, making sure that that there's a, you know, a report about it, that it's analyzed and there's an understanding of why it failed, right? So that needs to inform, you know, that needs to be something, those lessons need to be something that we learn from. And relatedly, at this stage in the process, because the process of finalizing caste lists will involve a close collaboration with, you know, regional census offices, state governments, local organizations, that process should be starting now in terms of finalizing, updating and finalizing all of the state administrative category lists. So if that's not happening, that's a sign that, you know, the design of the survey may not, you know, may have some of the same problems that we saw with the previous socioeconomic caste survey. In addition, the caste-related questions and answer options should be field tested, you know, multiple times throughout the country in advance of the kind of final pretest that all of the census questions will have, just given the kind of problems that happened last time, to make sure, you know, that there's this additional field testing with prior to the full census schedule, and similarly that the training for enumerators and the instructions that will accompany enumerators and households, that all of that gets written well in advance and gets tested. The Gazette of India will eventually, or should eventually, list the specific questions and answer options, but that might not happen for another year, for example. So that in some ways would be too late. So, you know, we want to make sure that the process of finalizing the caste lists and you know, that for each of the major state administrative categories, that process begins before. Similarly, we wouldn't want this sort of opt-out for elites, this no caste option in the kind of the same way that it was done before. And I think really relating to several of the questions you just asked, having a high-level committee that really develops guidelines for the ethical use of the caste-wise data is very important, and they should, you know, be involved with they should have access to kind of the caste-wise data from the 2011 SEC survey to see what those data, you know, why were they deemed unusable, what didn't work, what should happen this time, and advise the ORGI, and then, you know, along with that, developing a framework for how to use the collected data. And you know, I think all of that are very important things that should be happening now, well before the 2027 census, before the household enumeration actually happens.
Well, given the nature of how the Indian state, especially, is trying to deal with data over the last 1 decade, with an Indian state which is also very conscious of its brand, let's just hope that they go about doing this exercise accurately. And thank you so much for pointing out some of the things that viewers have to watch out for over the next 2 years.
Thank you, Pavan. Thank you so much for the opportunity to discuss my research with you.
And also, very big thanks for giving us this interview and speaking with The Wire.